Good afternoon, everybody, people online and people here. So thanks a lot, Rex, for the invitation first. I mean, I'm super glad to be here. So as you just mentioned, so what I would like to do today is to discuss some of my recent thoughts about what it means to maintain the beliefs. And I find that it was a perfect opportunity to discuss whether this makes sense for fundamentalist beliefs. So that's my, so I mean, it's quite, I did it really for this for this occasion, so I'm very curious about what you think about these ideas, and yeah, and I'm glad that I can get feedback thanks to you. So first of all, perhaps a few preliminaries. I assume people have access to the handout online. Do they?
I'm not sure, maybe we forgot about it.
Because if the handout is quite substantial, and I think that can be helpful, you want me to just, I leave you, nice.
Let me just paste that.
Okay.
We'll cut out this little bit in the recording.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Don't worry. I mean, it's no big deal. So should I keep going? And so I think if you can have open the handout once it's uploaded, then that's good.
Yeah, if you give me a second, I will.
Yeah, take you. I won't be super long anyway, so I think it's no big deal.
Maybe Google Drive. Yeah, the thing is, I don't know how to easily drop the handout in the chat.
Oh, can we share the screen? And it's your computer?
True, we could do that.
Share the screen and from you.
Right, that may be better. Right, I'll open it first.
And,
that's probably better. You're quite right. Let's do it that way. Here's the handout. That's a good idea. Share the screen.
Yeah.
This one.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay, here we go.
Now you can scroll down.
I can scroll down like that. Yeah, good, perfect. Sorry for the interruption. So let's start with a few preliminaries. Yeah. I think that one thing on which we could agree, and I think Rick agrees with it, is that fundamentalist beliefs, such as the belief, for instance, that science regarding the origin of the cosmos ought to be treated with skepticism, are blameworthy kind of beliefs if they are not excusable. Yeah. And because of this, we need to find a way of, making it possible to hold believers responsible for their fundamentalist beliefs. And this must, in fact, is met with this classical objection of doxastic involuntariness that you can find on the handout. Yeah, it's simply this idea that if a subject is responsible for her belief, then it needs to be so that she has some sort of control over the acquisition of this belief. And in fact, we usually think that we do not have this sort of control over our beliefs acquisition, because belief, in fact, are passive entities. We just receive them when we perceive something. For instance, if I perceive, I don't know, the screen in front of me, I just believe that there is this screen in front of me. I cannot control it. And I cannot acquire the belief that I like to acquire. For instance, I cannot simply believe that I am on a beach, I don't know, in Taiwan, or I don't know where, just because I want to. So that's not something I can do just like this. It's not something I control. And the conclusion of this objection is that, in fact, we cannot be held responsible for our beliefs. And that's annoying. And this is one problem that has been very, very extensively addressed in the literature in the ethics of beliefs. And one of the person who really addressed this problem a lot is Rick Pills. Yeah. And I simply wanted to just emphasize here that this premise 2, the acquisition of a belief is not something one controls, seems especially hard to deny in the case of fundamentalist beliefs, because most of the people think that these sort of beliefs are, in fact, paradigmatically beliefs that whose the acquisition of which is not something we control, because it's, for instance, one explanation is that they come from some sort of specific social context, so social isolation and stuff like that, or from some sort of psychiatric pathological situation that just trigger these sort of beliefs. That would be two kind of explanation of how this fundamentalist beliefs occur, and none of them leaves room for any kind of control. And so it seems that, you know, we might be tempted to think that we cannot hold people responsible, and then they cannot be blameworthy for their fundamentalist beliefs. And what I would like to do in this talk, in fact, is to consider one way of avoiding this conclusion, one way that, in fact, has been suggested by Matthew Chrisman in his very recent book. I'm not even sure this thing has been published already, but it will be published in the next few months at least. But we can find this solution also in a paper of him from 2016. Yeah. So Chrisman's solution to avoid this general, so Chrisman does not address the specific case of fundamentalist belief. So it's a solution for how we can hold people responsible for their belief in general. And his take on this problem is the following. So he suggests that we change the focus, that he suggests that we locate the sort of stochastic control that is necessary for responsibility, not in the acquisition of the belief, but in the maintenance of a belief system. And what I find interesting with this solution for fundamentalist belief is that it seemed, I find, a priori, especially promising as a solution. Why, and that's my guiding idea, and that's the reason why I wanted to present you this talk, is that it seems to me, and I'm curious about what your view are about that the acquisition of fundamentalist belief does not seem to be something that the believer controls so much for the reason I've just mentioned, yeah. But surely, or at least more certainly, it seems that the believer controls better the fact that she keeps maintaining it, that she does not reject them, even though, in fact, she possesses a lot of evidence to the contrary, despite the evidence of, for instance, the evidence provided by the testimony of others, or the simple fact that she's the only one believing this, and so on. So the maintenance seems to be a nice or exciting or promising way of locating control in the case of, in the specific case of fundamentalist beliefs. There is, oh yeah, sorry about that. And so the goal of the talk is to, in fact, assess whether this solution, even though it looks a priori promising, is a good solution. That's my goal, yeah. So to more precisely to answer the following question, is it suitable to rely on Chrisman's solution to capture the believer's responsibility for fundamentalist beliefs? That's what I want to do today. So the first part, it's a three-part talk here. The first part consists simply in presenting this solution of Matthew Chrisman, yeah. So Chrisman says in his book that maintenance of beliefs, so these things we do when we maintain beliefs, yeah, it's in fact has three main essential characteristics. First of all, he says to maintain a belief system is something dynamic, in that it involves changes, yeah. So here's what he says, you can find the quotation on your handout. It involves a kind of ongoing modulation of one's degree of confidence in particular propositions in light of one changing degrees of confidence in other propositions. So here is an example, just to have something more concrete in front of our eyes. So suppose that Paul is having a party for his birthday. Let's scroll up again. While he's setting up the table for his guest, Paul remembers and accordingly believes that his niece Susie won't come because his wife told him a few hours before that Susie just called to say she's feeling unwell. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Paul opened the doors and sees Susie. 1 hour after this, Paul realizes that his colleague Susan is not around, even though she usually never misses one of his parties. At this point, he also understands that his wife certainly confused Susie with Susan on the phone. So in this example, several modulation of Paul's belief systems took place. Yeah. For instance, one of the change that occurs is that Paul moves from the belief that Susie won't come to the party, to the belief that she came to the party when he sees her in front of the door. And he also moved from the belief that Susie is unwell to the belief that, in fact, it's not Susie who is unwell, but Suzanne and my wife, in fact, confuse both people. So this is all these sort of small, revision that we can, that we do and that we keep doing, in fact, in our belief system, that make it that we maintain them, So one thing that might strike you as being a little bit paradoxical is that when we speak about belief maintenance, in fact, we do admit, so that what might sound paradoxical is the fact that, in fact, belief maintenance implies change. So maintenance and change seems to be sort of, antonyms, but that's not so surprising in the end when we understand that, in fact, the maintenance of a belief system really requires these changes. Because if Paul, for instance, in this case, does not undergo this sort of changing in his belief systems, what will happen is that the belief system will include a lot of inconsistencies. For instance, the belief that Susie won't come to the party and the belief that she's there and comes to the party. And this sort of inconsistency conducts to simply the rejection of the whole belief system. So if we want to keep the belief system, to maintain it, then we need to do this sort of revisions. Otherwise, we will reject it. So one thing that is clear that even though, as I just said, the maintenance of the belief systems requires some changes, the changes cannot be absolutely radical, because if the changes that your belief system undergoes are radical, then it's not the same belief system anymore. So then it's the creation of a new one. So we need to find this sort of, if we want to really describe what it means to maintain a belief system, we need to admit that there are some changes, but we need to also say that these changes are not too radical. So one way of, drawing this middle line is to say that the changes involved in the creation of a new belief system affect the subject's most fundamental convictions. For instance, in the case of Paul, if he suddenly had started to believe that the person that rang at the door is not Susie, but some, stranger disguised in Susie, this is such a fundamental change about his perspective on the world that we could say, okay, in this case, he just create a new belief system to make sense of all this. But in most cases, we simply revise them with small changes that concern less significant beliefs or less fundamental beliefs. For instance, the simple belief that, okay, in fact, she's not sick anymore, and my wife, in fact, badly understood who called on the phone. That's not as fundamental as thinking that there are people who disguise themselves as your friends in front of your door. So that's one way of simply making sense of, these different degrees of importance in terms of changes. That makes a difference between simply revising the belief systems or creating a new one. But the main things to understand is that when we maintain a belief system, this belief system do undergo certain not radical changes. And in this sense, Chrisman says, maintaining a belief system is something dynamic. It just takes place in a dynamic way. So this is feature number 1. Now I'm going to move to feature number 2. Another thing that Chrisman says about the maintenance of a belief system is that they are relatively automatic in the sense of habitual and not passive. So what he means by this is, for instance, when Paul's move, so maybe I should say that before. So what he means by this is that the maintenance of a belief system is occasionally more like the unconscious activities of scratching my head while listening to a talk. So it's not something necessarily conscious and deliberate. And if we go back to the example I gave before, for instance, Paul moves from the belief that that Susie won't come to the party to the belief that she is in fact there, this is typically something, this is typically a revision of an updating of his beliefs that could be automatic and unconscious, but maybe the more, you know, sophisticated inference that goes from Susie is here, Susan is not here, so it's certainly Susan who is sick and my wife confused both people on the phone. This is more, you know, it requires perhaps more, you know, conscious deliberation about what happened. This is perhaps less automatic and habitual. So both things are possible, but one thing that is possible is that we do this automatically. Oh, I mean, in the sense that, not in the sense that it's not conscious, yeah. And then, and relatedly, and that's the most crucial feature for this talk and also for Christmas, given what he intends to achieve with his account, is that he thinks that these moderate changes undergone by a belief system, when it is maintained, are not passive. They are things that are actively performed by the subject, even though, as we just saw, sometimes in an unconscious way. So it's always something we do actively. And in this sense, I also think that, you know, this kind of change are things, because they are action, they are things we do, we control them in a way. Just like I can, even though it's unconscious, I can stop, you know, scratching my head. Like this is something I can control. And I think this is also true for beliefs, for the revision of our belief systems. We are actively performing this, and we control this maintenance in this sense. And since we control it, we can be responsible for it. So that's his solution to how we can solve or avoid the conclusion of the objection of doxastic involuntariness that you can find on your handout, yeah, that I mentioned previously. So this is for the first part, the presentation of Christman's solution. So what I would like to do now in the second part is to, you know, raise an objection against this view. And then in the third part, I would like to discuss whether, despite my objection, there's still something we can do. We can, you know, take out of Christman's account to solve the question whether we're responsible for our fundamentalist beliefs. So objection part 2. So one thing that Christman assumes is that there is something very different between maintaining a belief systems involving, for instance, 3 beliefs, yeah, the belief that P, the belief that Q, and the belief that R, during a certain time interval, T1 to T4. This is very different from being in the composite state consisting in believing that P, believing that Q, and believing that R during this same amount of time, yeah. Why is it different? Because according to him, as we just saw, maintaining is active. This is something we actively perform, while simply believing is not active, it's passive. And that's why, you know, as we discussed in the beginning, this is because beliefs are passive that we meet, in fact, this classical objection of doxastic voluntariness. So Christman says that's a big difference, you know, maintaining a belief system is something active, while believing is not something active. And I think that this is wrong. Like, this difference is not the right one between the two kind of things, between, you know, maintaining a belief systems or believing the different holding the different beliefs that compose the belief systems. So in my view, the difference, in fact, is not a matter of passive versus active, just as Christman says, it's a purely metaphysical difference. So the difference is that the maintenance of the system of belief is an occurring entity. More precisely, it's a process. So it's a very specific kind of metaphysical entity, and it is not a state. So a state is a different kind of metaphysical entity. And that's the difference between the two. Believing the belief that P plus the belief that Q plus the belief that R is a composite state, while maintaining a belief system is to be in a process. It's a not different kind of metaphysical entity. I would like to show you now. And so that means also that the difference is not active and passive, as we will see. So that's what I would like to show you now. And in fact, this objection is in 2 parts. So first, I will show you why the difference revolves around the process versus state metaphysical distinction and not active versus passive. And in a second time, I will show you why, in fact, certain specific instances of belief system maintenance do constitute bona fide activities, but not all of them, only certain. So it's not true that every time I maintain my belief system, I'm actively doing something. It's only in certain specific cases. And this is what I think Crispin is missing with his account. Okay, so this is a two-step argument. Yeah, so first step, why is it that maintaining a belief system is a process while believing is a state? So for this, I need to explain this. In fact, I need to just rely on this classical criterion of distinction between processes and states.
No, could you scroll down again?
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry for that. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of this. Yeah, that's where we are. Okay, so I need to, just rely on this classical criterion between processes and states. So I'm here 2A now, yeah. Left on your screen. And this criterion is the following: processes have temporal parts while states do not. Yeah, I'm going to explain this now. What does it mean for one entity to have a temporal part? So the best way of understanding this is with the help of examples. So take, for instance, the 100 Years' War. So this is typically a process, it's not a state, because it has temporal parts. That's the criterion, yeah. Because, and what does it mean to have temporal parts? That means that these things, if we cut these things that is the war in question, into pieces, we do not get the whole things at each cut. You know, when we cut it in the middle, we have only half of it, for instance, not the whole thing already. That means that these things has temporal parts, metaphysically speaking. So typically, if you think so, that 100 Years' War did start in 1337 and lasted until 1453. So this is a little bit, in fact, a bit more than 100 years, but yeah, that's just the way we called it. Yeah. Anyway, so if you think about what happened, for instance, in 1430, when Jeanne d'Arc has been captured, yeah, and at every other moment before this date, in fact, what already occurred before 1430 was only a part of the whole process consisting in the 100 Years' War. So it's not as if the 100 Years' War were already there in its entirety in 1430. So that's the evidence, thanks to the example, that this is a process that has temporal parts, because we will not say, just like a football match, you know, if at the, I mean, in the middle of a football match, you don't have the whole football match already. You have only half of it. So that's just the same. It's a process. It's not a state. And states, for instance, are things like, you know, the state of liquidity, of being at 65 degrees or stuff like that. And states do not behave this way. You know, for instance, take the states. So mental states are also states, like desires, for instance, knowledge and beliefs are usually taken to be states. So my desire, for instance, to eat cinnamon rolls during the whole weekend, so these things last during the whole weekend. So suppose I really want to eat cinnamon rolls from Saturday morning to Sunday evening until this desire extinguishes. But this lasts, but this does not unfold through this weekend, because at each time during this weekend, this desire to eat cinnamon roll is already present in its entirety. On Saturday evening, for instance, and at every moment during this weekend until this desire extinguishes. So this desire has no temporal parts. It is there completely at each moment during this whole weekend. While the football match or the film at the cinema is something that takes place in time, unfolds in time, and if we cut it, we don't have the whole things, we have only part of it. So it has temporal parts. And this, so what I want to show now, in fact, is that the maintenance of a belief system is something that has temporal parts. And that's why it's a process, while believing is simply a state, as it's usually accepted. Yeah. And to show this, I want to rely on an analogy because it's a little bit helpful, I find. So the argument here is to tell, the maintenance of a belief system is a process because most of the maintenance of system in general are processes. So why would it be different for the maintenance of a belief system? And the system that I'm going to discuss quickly is the maintenance of an ecosystem. Because ecosystem, just like belief systems, in fact, is a system made of interdependent states. So for instance, most often, the states in question are the amount of praise in comparison to the amount of predators. So this is a state of the matter about an ecosystem at some point. And these are interdependent kind of states, And just like, in fact, the belief system, the ecosystem maintains itself by modifying some of its state. For instance, by modifying how many praise are available in order to just keep the number of predators not too high, or the contrary, if you have too many if you have too many predators, then you need to just decrease. So that usually what happens is that the number of praise decreases and then the number of predators too. And we get this balance, And so just like belief systems too, because it involves these small changes, it in fact also is something dynamic. So this seems to be very similar. I think the analogy works quite well, and I think it helps to see why the maintenance of a belief system, just like the maintenance of an ecosystem, is a process. So take a concrete case, take for instance the maintenance of the ecosystem, which is the Great Barrier Reef. So typically this maintenance is a process that unfolds in time and has temporal parts. So this, the emergence of the Great Barrier Reef, one thing that it's roughly like 20,000 years before now. And so the very first, the emergence of the very first structure of coral there, And if you think of what was present or existing in 378, so when at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, it's only a part of the maintenance of the ecosystem of the Great Barrier Reef, because it's still existing now. So it's only a part of it. So maintenance of an ecosystem is a process, and by analogy, maintenance of a belief system that works exactly the same is a process too. It's simply one thing that has temporal parts and that unfolds in time, and just like the maintenance of an ecosystem does. As we shall see, this ecosystem analogy is even more useful to do my second point, But first, now, the conclusion of my point 2a. So what this shows is that just like the maintenance of an ecosystem has temporal parts, while the state that this ecosystems involve does not. So the number of praise or the number of predators, they are just states of the ecosystem that do not have temporal parts. They exist in the entirety at each moment. But the maintenance of the Great Barrier Reef, then that has temporal parts. So this, just like the maintenance of an ecosystem has temporal parts, the maintenance of the belief system has temporal parts, while the belief that these belief systems involves do not. So this is just a way of showing, okay, we have a difference between what it means to maintain and what it means to believe, to maintain beliefs or to beliefs, just punctuals, But this is not a matter, at least a priori, there's a difference that I've just tried to, in fact, to pinpoint, is not something that has to do with active passive. It has to do rather with the kind of metaphysical entity at work. But I still want to, one thing that Matthew Crispin could answer is to say, some processes are active. So you haven't shown yet that the difference is not of the active versus passive kind, because I could tell you, okay, you're right about this metaphysical difference between processes and states, but the processes in question are active according to me. So now what I would like to show in a second time, this is my point 2b, is that this is wrong. In fact, these processes of maintenance of belief systems are not necessarily active. And here again, I would like to rely on this analogy with an ecosystem. So ideally, so think about ecosystems again to know what happens very often, in fact, maybe sadly, very often, is that humans have to, interact with ecosystem to, maintain them. So for instance, they have to actively limit the number of prey to keep having predators, not having too many predators, and to keep the balance between this different kind of states, or they have to act on the environment to, just by, for instance, removing some of the food there to help, getting this balance again. So this is clearly something, this is a way of maintaining an ecosystem that is clearly active. So this is something human beings actively do for ecosystem on occasion. Yeah. And I would like to call this way of, actively maintain systems managerial system maintenance. And I agree that managerial system maintenance is active. And I think that's very intuitive too. And I think something is similarly true for belief systems. So there are cases, undeniably, when a believer managerially keeps her system of beliefs stable or current by modifying slightly some of the beliefs inside the system. So for instance, by amending some of them, by tempering others, by adding one. And this is something that she actively performs. So maybe, for instance, in my case with Paul, maybe when Paul just starts thinking, oh, my wife, it's not that she lied to me, but maybe she simply confused Susie and Suzanne. And that's why she believed Susie was sick, but in fact, it was Suzanne who was sick. So all this, that's certainly something that Paul did in a way actively. And maybe that's what we might call managerial system maintenance. So in this case, managerial beliefs system maintenance. So that happened for sure. But in fact, now think about ecosystem again. So I'm sorry, we go back and forth between belief system and ecosystem, but I think that helps to make my point. So think about ecosystems again. Ideally, human beings should not, in fact, interact, and they should not necessarily, they do not necessarily have, or at least ideally they should, ideally there will be no need for action of human being. That will be better in ecosystems. So well-functioning ecosystem, in fact, adapt the number of prey and the number of predators automatically by itself. So for instance, for instance, the prey develops some sort of new adaptive responsive to the predators. That's one way of, being a better prey and, being less eaten by predators and, keeping the number of predators lower. And from time to time, it's simply, in fact, the predator themselves that, get into difficulties. Like, this is just the way it works quite often. Like, automatically, the system modulates itself. And if you think of other systems than ecosystems, so for instance, the physiological system, like the circulatory system, so this is also something that takes place automatically. Like, so, so the idea of the circulatory system is that the blood brings oxygen and nutrients to the cells and get rid of the waste. And this is, this works more or less well. And there is an adaptation of this by, increasing or decreasing the heart rate. And this is something that happens automatically. This is not something that is managerially, performed, or at least not in well-functioning human beings. They do that, of course, in hospitals to help us surviving, but not when everything goes well for human beings. And so this, what I want to say, that this kind of maintenance of systems, the physiological system or the ecosystem that I've just mentioned, these are auto maintenance, as I call them. And nobody will ever think that this is something active. So nobody will ever think that we maintain the oxygen in our blood actively, that this is an action that we perform. And nobody will ever think that the Great Barrier Reef actively decreases the number of red basses or sharks in its water to help, getting inert praise. This is not something that the Great Barrier Reef does actively. It's just something that happens. And so that shows that many cases of beliefs of systems maintenance, whether ecosystems or physiological systems, but this is also true of belief systems, because as I said, I think this is a completely analogous in this regard. Belief system, just as ecosystem and physiological system, do in fact get maintained automatically in this way, but this is not active. So this is not true that every time a belief system maintains itself, this is an action or this is something we do. In some cases, yes, just as I mentioned in the beginning. And just like in some cases, the ecosystems gets maintained because of human action, but in many cases, it's not like that. So it's not true that maintenance implies action always. So this is where I disagree with Chrisman. So that's my objection, yeah. And the conclusion of this point 2b, you can find it on the handout, is that in well-functioning minds, belief systems automatically adjust to new facts and information, just as ecosystems adapt to environmental changes. Since we do not consider this form of automatic adaptation characterizing ecosystem to be activities performed by the ecosystem, so as I say, the Great Barrier Reef does not do change, does not actively maintains. It's not an action that the Great Barrier Reef performs. So since we do not consider this form of automatic adaptation characterizing ecosystem to be activities performed by the ecosystem, why should we consider the automatic adjustment of the belief system to be an activity of the mind? It seems to me that the burden of the proof lies with those who breaks off the analogy. So this is my objections against Chrisman's view. And what I would like to discuss to conclude is where does this leave us? Yeah. So first of all, so one question, so that's the main question of the talk. So does it mean that we have to give up the idea of relying on belief system maintenance to capture responsibility for fundamentalist beliefs? And I think, no, we still have this possibility. It's simply that we have to make clear that the kind of maintenance that is susceptible to ground the responsibility for fundamentalist beliefs is this managerial maintenance, not this automatic one. So simply, it's not always the case that when you maintain a belief system, whether fundamentalist or not, you are responsible for it. On some occasion, no. What we need to check is whether this is something you managerially control or not. And I think this option is in fact quite good for people like Rick and me, because in fact we have a view of what is a doxastic responsibility in terms of, you know, I called it consequential kind of doxastic responsibility. Piels had this view, Rick had this view about how we influence our beliefs. And we can also find this view by Nikolai Nottelman, who were there too, no? He came to give a talk too. So yeah. Oh, okay, so he comes later. So so we can easily, with this sort of view, understand, in fact, how to make sense of this managerial kind of system maintenance. Yeah. Because we can explain how, you know, we can influence indirectly our belief system in such a way as to maintain it. So that's one thing. So it's not that this is the end of this idea. It just shows that this idea has to be, you know, fine-tuned in such a way as to really, you know, put the finger on where the doxastic responsibility for fundamentalist belief really lies. And point B, and I find this interesting, I'm curious about what you think about it. So one question that I asked myself when I was preparing this talk is, what is the implication of this view, of this conclusion, for the rationality of the maintenance of a belief system? So what does it, when can we say to someone you ought to, what is the condition under which one ought to maintain a belief system? And since maintaining a belief system is an action, you know, a process So managerial maintenance of a belief system is an action. Yeah, that's what I say. So what rationalize this sort of action cannot be evidence, because evidence is not a reason to maintain stability occurrence. So it's not, you don't maintain stability of occurrence for the reason that P seems true. You maintain stability of coherence because you have some practical reason to maintain stability or coherence. And I think that one of the implication of the view that we are responsible for our for the maintenance of our belief system because we can control managerially the way we keep coherence and stability over this belief system. So one implication is that, in fact, what can be, we are in fact blameworthy, so what is criticizable in our behavior is when we, in fact, maintain this belief system for bad practical reasons. So when we should not maintain it, but we keep doing it, but this should be captured in terms of practical reasons. So the problem is not whether it has a chance to be true or not. The problem is that the reason why we control our belief system and amend it in a way as such that they are trumped by other stronger practical reasons. So suppose, for instance, that I am a fundamentalist, and one of the reasons why I want to maintain my belief system is, for instance, the fact that I give a few examples on the handout, the fact that it will preserve my psychological stability, that it will avoid some painful psychological disruption in my beliefs. Or for instance, another reason what I could just put forward is the reluctance that I have to fully change my mind about the topic, because this is painful too, you know. So these are the kind of these are practical reasons to keep stability in a belief system, to maintain it. And when is this problematic? It's problematic when you have other practical reasons that are stronger, that trump this one. So typically in the case of fundamentalist beliefs, the fact that they might have these terrible consequences for other people. So this is another practical reason. It is much stronger and much more that trumped my personal reason to keep this stability, because I don't want to live any psychological disruption in my life. So what this in fact shows is that the rationality, or what the rationality of maintenance of belief system is a matter not of evidence, because it's an action, this is something we do, and evidence do not rationalize action, but of practical reason, such as, for instance, how bad it would be for me to change my mind, but also some other, perhaps more, ethical, practical reason, like, for instance, how bad it will be for others if I keep this belief, because I will act in certain ways, and so on and so forth. And so I find this quite an exciting outcome for what it means to, try to, so for the, the view that, if I find it interesting to think about the maintenance of belief system, the rationality of the maintenance of belief system in these practical terms. And I find it especially exciting because I'm not sure this is also true for acquisition and rejection of belief system. And usually we philosophers or epistemologists as well, we put acquisition, maintenance, rejection on the same level. And if I'm right about that, then maybe we're wrong about it. So maybe acquisition and rejection might, be governed by epistemic principle that have to do with evidence, but maybe the maintenance of occurrence and stability is in fact rationalized by practical reasons of different kinds. And that's my conclusion for today. So I hope I haven't been too long. But thanks a lot for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much.